So no one's planning on going to China after this, right?
Yeah, or Hong Kong.
Okay, let's dive in. Jason, we have a very special guest with us this week. Perth Toll from the Life and Liberty Indexes, founder of the Freedom ETF, FRDM, works with our close buddy, Wes Gray, over at Alpha Architect to get that launched. But she is the brains and the muscle behind the operation. So we're super excited to have her on the show today to talk about all things related to sort of what's been going on with the regulatory regime shifts in China, what it means for investors in emerging markets, and maybe some ways we can rethink tapping into those markets with an eye towards economic liberty and freedom as being our guideposts. So with that well-scripted intro, Jason, I'm just going to turn it over to you and let loose.
And I'm gonna abdicate my responsibilities and just go straight to Perth. I just want to hear from you, 30,000 foot view. Kind of describe to me what the Life and Liberty Indexes are.
Sure. Thanks for having me, guys. This is an honor to be on Pirates.
You are without doubt the worst pirate I've ever heard of.
But you have heard of me.
So Life and Liberty Indexes is an index company that uses personal and economic freedom metrics as primary factors in our investment process. So our goal is to create we created a way for investors in emerging markets to be able to avoid autocracies, which are very high. They typically have very high concentration of most emerging markets indexes, and to have a higher weight to the freer markets, because we believe that freer markets recover faster. They have more sustainable growth, and they use their personal and economic capital, or human and economic capital, more efficiently, and have less capital flight and capital destruction. So, we overweight the freer markets, underweight the less free markets, and the worst human rights offenders are excluded altogether. So we try to eliminate that tail risk of which kind of what you're seeing in China now for investors.
And what do you think about, it's easier said than done, right? How do we weight freedom and human freedom indexes? And so maybe we dive into the meat of the matter, like kind of what metrics do you use to assess the emerging markets?
Yeah, so we use quantitative metrics by the Cato Institute, the Fraser Institute, and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. Sometimes we incorporate Freedom House as well. There's all kinds of metrics out there, but we like to capture both personal and economic freedoms, and these data sets do that for us. So our data providers use 76 different metrics encompassing the rights to, I call it civil freedom, political freedom, and economic freedom. So I divide it into those three categories. They divide it into two categories, personal and economic freedom. But I just use the end composite score for each country that has all of those 76 in there. So, civil freedoms include things like disappearances, torture, trafficking, women's rights. Political freedoms are things like free speech, freedom of the media, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, due process, civil procedure, criminal procedure, things like that. And then economic freedoms are things like rule of law, private property rights, taxation, business regulations, freedom to trade internationally, and so forth. So we look at all of those added up together. They come up with a composite country score for 162 countries. We use what's in the 26 country emerging markets universe and weight and allocate two of those countries according to those freedom scores.
So a country like China today has literally zero allocation in your ETF and has never had any allocation. Correct. Within the ETF.
ETF's been around for about 2 years. We never had any China, Russia, Saudi Arabia.
So I don't want to pick on China, but I feel like it is a good sort of case study for maybe how some of these concepts around freedom actually impact capital investment, particularly over the last 8 months, 12 months. It feels like we've sort of been watching a slow motion regulatory train wreck starting back.
I feel like the last week is like 12 months.
Well, yes. Yeah. I felt that way all throughout COVID.
Yeah.
But no, so it starts in November 2020, right? When I think Ant Technologies is the official name, was completely torpedoed in trying to go public by Beijing regulators, and Alibaba founder Ma just disappeared from public view for several months. And it was sort of like, well, this happens, which is a little weird. And then in May, you had a huge crackdown in crypto. In June, you had, sort of towards the end of June, you had DiDi, going public and listing in the US. And then you had this immediate crackdown for cybersecurity reasons. And then more recently in July, you had this huge crackdown on firms that were trying to profit from educational matters. And I guess under the guise of trying to make having children cheaper, is my understanding.
Yes.
Maybe you can explain that one to me. But it seems like there's been this sort of big regulatory tail risk out there for people. And there's one article I saw that I think really summed it up well, which was, this is sort of, quote, law without order, that it's all these shocks and surprises. And I don't know what the end game is here, but certainly seems like from an investment perspective, invites a tremendous amount of risk. So maybe you can talk through, maybe using those as examples or not, how this sort of threads with China and how that fits or does not with your ETF.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a great case study for us, actually, because it's happening in real time. And it is a perfect example of why economic freedom matters. So in China, we've always never had it in there mostly because of human freedom, human freedoms, including both personal and economic freedom, but especially the personal freedom, they're especially bad at. We all know about, what's happening over there, in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong. But now they're clamping down on the other side, economic freedom, which is the one side that they had been making progress on over the last 30 years. So, over the last 30 years, China's, government stepped back a little bit on the economic freedom side. So they went from very abysmal policies where millions of people died in famine under Mao, right, to not so bad policies. And that was a huge improvement for the, economic policies and opening up over there. And that created this kind of economic miracle over the last 30 years. Now, that being said, foreign investors have not benefited from that growth to the extent that you would think based on all the China talk out there. If you look at something large cap like FXI, China large cap, it's returned about 26% over the last 10 years. Cumulatively. And South Korea, which is a neighboring market, is about double that. And Taiwan, another neighboring market, is returned about 170% over that same 10-year time period. So it's really a myth that, foreign investors can take part in the growth in these emerging markets that are not very free. They don't have shareholder protections. They don't have private property rights. They can siphon those returns off to where they want it to go. So that's kind of what happened the last 30 years. You had this like dramatic growth because the government stepped back, and now you see a reversal of that. The government is, it's like the pendulum swinging the other way. These favored industries like tech, favored CEOs like Jack Ma getting this kind of stuff happening, and like the IPO, for example, that you're talking about, Ant Financial, that was supposed to be the biggest IPO of all time in the world, right? So that would have been a huge success story for China. For them to not care about that, because Jack Ma said something that offended them at a conference, is mind-boggling to me. So, and that would have been a great PR win for China's business climate and just their country in general. So for them to give that up, I think was the first really telltale sign that there has been a sea change and the game has changed at this point. And then it just kind of went on from there, on and on. And story after story. Last week, we saw them turn they had some very profitable tutoring companies, right? Online tutoring, kind of like edu-tech companies. And, some of these were, I was looking at them, for like, wow, these, if I invested in China, this would actually be kind of a really good investment because they're doing really well. But then, over the weekend on a Saturday, regulators mount up, came out and said, all education tech companies have to become nonprofits. You now have to register as nonprofits. You're not allowed to make a profit. You're not allowed to go and get foreign capital overseas, do IPOs, things like that. You can no longer raise capital. You're a nonprofit. no more profits. I mean, and then the education companies went down like 70% overnight. So this is literally like the state can just come in and take your future profits away. I mean, how do you operate as a business in that environment? So yeah, this is a tail risk that we definitely don't feel like is worthwhile at any cost.
Perth, what do you think about like the general speculation of, you know, Chinese investment companies using soft power to buy like American media? Like we haven't seen any sort of Chinese villain in an American movie in the last like decade, where during the Cold War we had plenty of Russian villains.
I think the only industry that's been worse about kind of kowtowing to China is Hollywood. But only one worse than Wall Street is Hollywood, or maybe they're on par. So you saw the John Cena apology, right?
Yeah.
And is just like absurd. And China just had its first film festival where the best documentary category was vacant because 4 documentaries were pulled due to technical issues. And so it was like all censored. The entire category, like all 4 films that were nominated were censored. So at their first film festival. So yeah, no, that's also about control, because it's, you know, he who controls, you know, media or movies and things that like that, they can influence public opinion. And so they're they want very tight control over public opinion, over their kind of their image in the eyes of especially their own people, but also outside. And that's why they don't allow, you know, Facebook, Twitter, all these social media platforms that they can't control in the country.
One of the big trends we've seen, Perth, over the last decade has been actually a big push within Wall Street towards the indexers to increase the allocation of China within emerging market indices. And that, I think that really came to a head around 2015, 2016, where there was going to be these new adoption. You were going to see an increased weight. It was going to be smoothed over time, but you were going to see an increased weight to China.
Yeah.
You launched your ETF 2 years ago, absolutely zero China exposure, and it has more or less tracked emerging markets almost perfectly, which I find very surprising. And I know some people would say, well, it hasn't outperformed, but I would say, great, you get your cake and can eat it too.
Yeah.
Like you get something that has tracked emerging markets perfectly, in line with the theory perhaps that you're going to get greater long-term economic growth. 2 years, who cares? It's just the short-term noise. But it's not like you're actually missing this big component that I thought you would be missing. And I was wondering whether you could talk to that at all, because that actually really surprised me, that you could take out this huge part of the index and it doesn't seem to have mattered much.
Yeah, so that is a kind of a cool outcome in my opinion as well. So thanks for noticing. So most emerging markets indexes have 40% weight to China. And then also additional weights to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, Russia. So about half autocracies. And that's just due to market cap weighting and the nature of the emerging markets classifications, right? They're all a bunch of autocratic countries. So you know, we try to solve this problem for investors and create a solution where they can be invested in emerging markets, participate in that growth in a more efficient way and without those autocracies. And so yeah, it has zero China, no Russia, Saudi Arabia, no Turkey, no Egypt, and yet it has performed in line. Now, what you're looking at is a over 2-year-old track record. What you don't see there, if you look at that, you know, zoomed out, if you zoom in on certain parts, there is a separation. There is a dispersion tracking error. So like during the COVID drawdown, right? We underperformed because China, its market did not go down as much during that drawdown in 2020. And then if you look at the recovery, we outperformed because freer markets tend to do that. They're you know, faster coming out of recoveries because they have the conditions on the ground to respond to what people need instead of government trying to tell them what they need. So like, for example, when COVID first happened in the US, the government was like, hey, don't wear masks because we need those masks for the medical workers. We're going to run out of masks. The government didn't foresee that people were going to be selling masks on Etsy all the clothing manufacturers were going to be now making masks, and there's going to be this overabundance of masks, right? So the marketplace took care of that on their own and responded to that need. In a freer market, it's easier to do that. And so there's more flexibility to respond to market trends and to innovate. So they recover much faster. And you saw in the recovery that we outperformed broad emerging markets, we outperformed emerging markets ESG, and we even outperformed emerging markets ex-China. So even taking out that China difference, we still outperformed during the recovery because this was the freer country set. And so if you look at the overall, zoom back out, then it comes out even. But there were times of underperformance and overperformance if you zoom in on certain timeframes.
If you take out like the obvious like dictators or genocidal countries, and you get maybe more nuanced into like maybe state-owned enterprises in Brazil, where we saw Operation Car Wash had tremendous amount of corruption within Brazil. How do you like assess that within your index?
Yeah, so we exclude state-owned enterprises to bring the economic freedom theme all the way through, and I think that is helpful, more helpful in the freer markets. Because in the unfree markets, if you look at China, Ant Financial, DiDi, ByteDance, all the edu-tech companies, none of those were state-owned companies that have been affected recently. So there's no distinction between state-owned and non-state-owned if your entire market is owned by the state. So in freer markets, though, there is a distinction.
And if I were to steelman the other side of this argument, there's a lot of people that would argue that the United States or Western democracies commit a lot of atrocities and genocides around the world, but the winner gets to write history. I'm curious how you deal with the haters on the other side.
Absolutely, hear that all the time. Oh yeah, the U.S. Puts kids in cages and all this stuff, and it's absolutely true. We have our own problems. There is no 100% free market, and there's no 100% oppressive market. Even in China, it is possible to be an entrepreneur, to make money, to make a living for your family. It's you have some freedom to do certain things, and even in the U.S. And by the way, the U.S. is like number 17 out of 162, so it's not like we're the best. We have a lot of problems, but the difference is there is a plurality of political parties. There is a system of checks and balances. It's not one centralized person in power, so it's with no checks and balances. It's there are pluralities, and there is an electoral process that is mostly sound. So yeah, that's the difference, is that if we're doing things that are bad, we come up against that ourselves. Our people have freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of media, and we can be kind of that force of checking the government.
How do you think about the nuance of metrics, right? If we look at an aggregate index or an aggregate metric, a lot of times we don't, the map is not the territory. Like I think about maybe, Bhutan over 20 years ago came out with the gross happiness index, right? It was really kind of easy to game that index if you didn't allow people in your country to have mobile phones, satellite TV, or internet. And they've had a lot more problems recently with that. And so they've, even on their own index, they've fallen into like the bottom quartile or the bottom third. But it's part of the issue of using aggregate indexes or any sort of nuance within metrics. Absolutely. I'm sure you've thought about this a lot. Like how do you address those kind of issues when you're dealing with, an index of metrics?
With human rights data, there's a couple of ways to do it. You can do it kind of like what you're describing, which is a survey method where you're asking people and they're responding on their devices or whatever. You can also look at the regulations, the laws that are in place, what the laws say. But as we know, especially in some of these rule by law instead of rule of law countries, what the law says doesn't matter at all. And so you can also look at the custom in a country, culture, right? So our data providers are doing an aggregate of third-party data. So our providers have those 76 metrics. Those 76 metrics come from third parties. So there's a network of think tanks around the world that's in their freedom network, and it's 100 think tanks. And we have meetings every year. So every year there's a world freedom meeting, and then there's a North America freedom meeting. So I typically try to make it to one of the two. And there are people on the ground from each of these countries that kind of give you color and insight into what's going on, and they each approve the final score.
If there's one thing that Jason and I love as entrepreneurs ourselves, it is an inspiring entrepreneurial story. And Perth, I know that even though this ETF is just 2 years old, this is something you have been trying to breathe life into for long before that. And I was hoping maybe you could share some of that story.
Sure. So, you know, I've wanted to do this for a long time, and I grew up in both China and the U.S. So I saw personally firsthand the difference that freedom made in my life, especially when I went back and lived in Hong Kong after college. So I traveled while I was in Hong Kong to Beijing and Shanghai, kind of just to, you know, that's what you do when you're over there, you just like travel between cities, and you know, for fun on the weekends or whatever. I had a friend in Shanghai who was the exact same as me in every single way. We were like the exact same age. She was just like all of my American friends in every single way. But she didn't have an existence on paper. Like she didn't have a birth certificate or school records or medical records or social security benefits, or like she just doesn't exist on paper because her parents chose to register her brother for school because of the one-child policy. The one-child policy is a policy in China, started around 1978 and was out for about 30 years. And you were only allowed to have one child per family. Of course, if you're not married, you're not allowed to have children and so forth. So it's like, there's a lot of control on people's lives over there. That's obviously a reproductive freedom, which is a personal freedom. And we do account for that in our metrics as there's a missing women proxy that kind of accounts for that. So there's 30 million missing women in China because of this one child policy. And that's official Chinese think tank data estimates. Other estimates have it as high as 60 million. So you think about it, my generation, 30 million missing women, that's 30 million men who have no prospect of finding a wife. That's a problem, right, socially. Now we're facing the worst demographics in the world. In China, exacerbated by this policy. And that's why they've gone now to two-child policy and then to three-child policy. Nobody's having two or three children. And that's why they're cracking down on edu-tech. So they're trying to fix this one bad policy with another bad policy instead of just revoking the bad policy, right? Doesn't make sense. It's like, so all the freedoms work together. Our data providers like to say, like the parts of an automobile. You can't have a transmission without a steering wheel. The car still won't run, right? They're basically trying to fix the transmission by ripping out the steering wheel. So that doesn't work. But anyway, so after I left Fidelity, at the time that I left, you know, I did have in mind that I wanted to start this company, but my main reason for leaving was I had a small child and I wanted to stay home with her for a little bit until she went to school. And she, you know, so I was actually, you know, if you look at my like LinkedIn and stuff like that, it has like, I started this in 2014. I did. First iteration of the index was 2014, and the current iteration is since 2017. But for about 2 or 3 years, I did very little work. So it's like being a mom and just working on this part-time whenever I could. She was very young, so I was like, and I'm not like very good at multitasking. So you know, after a while, so like around 2017, I was like, okay, we need to nail down like the versions of the index we're going to use. And so at that time, we eliminated everything. All the other factors, originally we had like some value factors in there, and I took all of that out and just focused on freedom, because the main feedback we were getting was, hey, freedom is the main innovation here. If I wanted a value tilted emerging markets fund, I could get that elsewhere. So I made it just freedom, and we isolated that factor for this first product. Around the same time, I have been speaking at a couple of CFA societies about China and emerging markets and these new freedom metrics. And one of them, after one of my talks, this was the Tampa Society. It was like my first year doing this. I had no idea what I was doing. I was on there with David Kotak, BlackRock, and Morningstar. And so I was like, what's going on here? And so after that, David Kotak invites me to this thing called Camp Kotak. And I'm like, what is this? Like 50 economists and finance people going fishing in the woods, like almost in Maine with no Wi-Fi. Like, who does this?
Lightning bolt! Lightning bolt! Lightning bolt!
And so my friend Christian says to me, hey, you know what? Barry Ritholtz goes to that camp. You should go so you can meet Barry. I was like, all right. So I go to this camp so I can meet Barry Ritholtz.
I hate to interrupt, but for people who have never heard of this, Camp Kotak, which Jason, I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It is very famous in certain circles and has a very extensive wait list. Like you cannot go at this point, you know, unless you've been going for years. And if you go and then choose not to go back the next year, you're off the list. So very exclusive group of financial professionals, economists, and so forth.
It's very, very, very cool. And so I was on my way to Camp Kotak. I had some meetings in New York, and I called you have to take a seaplane to get in there from the airport. So I called the seaplane company. I'm like, hey, is it too late to get a seaplane for today? I'm coming in from LaGuardia today. And they were like, no, you can share with Rob Arnott. I was like, what? They're like, yeah, Rob Arnott doesn't have a partner on the seaplane. It's 2 people per plane. Just go intercept him at the airport. Here's his flight number. And so I'm like, okay. And so like when I left Fidelity, right, the first thing I did was contact research affiliates and say, hey, you guys are doing non-cap weighted indexing. I'm doing non-cap weighted indexing. Do you want to work together on this? And they were like, please go away. Like I could not get past any gatekeeper. But now I'm sharing a plane with Rob Arnott. So I intercept him at the airport. I'm like, hey, did they tell you we're going to be writing together? And he's like, yeah. And he's turned out like super cool guy. And he hears the idea. He loves it. He becomes our first seed investor. Before we had a fund, he committed money to the fund. And now at this point, he is a partner in my company. So he owns 10% of Life and Liberty Indexes. And then other people started supporting us, people like you guys, over and over. And it was just like, it was an idea that resonated with people, and it was bigger than me all the time. And I've known that the whole time. And I'm so thankful for all the support that we've had. And that's just, it's just something that I feel like I get to do, and I get to bring this thing to market that didn't exist before. There was no freedom weighted option before for investors, and now there is. And I'm just so thankful for that.
Well, Perth, we can't thank you enough for joining us. This has been very informative, very excited, very happy for you, and congratulations for breathing life into this. Everyone who's still with us, don't forget to like, subscribe. Most importantly, go check out the Freedom 100 Emerging Market Fund, FRDM. ETF has been live for 2 years. Go check it out. Go support entrepreneurs. And last thing, if you want cool Pirates merch like this, hound Jason on Twitter.
Now make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss one of these amazing episodes.